3 days after the HOA tried to shut down my well, the entire neighborhood ran dry. Faucets hissed hoses, coughed out air, and for the first time, every single homeowner in Sycamore Ridge realized what I'd known all along: their modern infrastructure had been living off my water for years. And when I shut it off, their empire cracked like dry earth. I moved to Sycamore Ridge 15 years ago, back when it was just dirt roads, scattered houses, and the kind of silence you could hear your heartbeat in. After my wife passed, I wanted peace, not manicured lawns and newsletters. I was a retired civil engineer, too old to play politics, and too stubborn to let anyone tell me how to live. My house came with a deep artesian well drilled decades before the HOA even existed. Legal, permitted, inspected. That well wasn't just water. It was independence, a quiet rebellion humming beneath the ground. Then the neighborhood changed. Cookie-cutter homes, identical fences, SUVs, and golden retrievers. One day there was no HOA, the next there was. Randall Stokes became president, the kind of man who polished his shoes before stepping on other people's property. He sent glossy newsletters full of fake smiles and friendly reminders. I ignored most of it, paid my small dues, and minded my own damn business. Until one Monday morning, I got a letter thicker than a tax bill. Effective immediately, it said you must cease use of your private well and connect to the municipal water grid within 30 days. It claimed my well posed a potential hazard to neighborhood infrastructure and water equity. Water equity. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. My well was older than their bylaws, tested cleaner than bottled water, and came with permits signed by the county. Still, something about that letter got under my skin. The arrogance. The idea that a committee of weekend gardeners thought they could rewrite geology. So I went into my garage, dragged out the old file cabinet, and spread every document I owned across the kitchen table. Drilling permits, geological surveys, even a signed easement giving my parcel perpetual groundwater rights. They wanted a fight, fine. But they had no idea they were standing on my battlefield. What the HOA didn't know was that years ago, when the subdivision first expanded, someone had tied the early homes into my well system during a drought. The connection had never been decommissioned. Quiet, forgotten, but still flowing. For years, my well had been feeding water to half a dozen homes, including, ironically, the HOA presidents. 2 weeks later, another letter came. This one was hand-delivered by a kid in a polo shirt, no words, just a smirk. It said I'd failed to prove compliance with modern filtration standards. I realized then this wasn't about safety, it was about control. If they could force me onto their grid, they'd own my water, my property, and a little piece of my dignity. That night I sat at the table with a bottle of bourbon, the HOA bylaws, and a highlighter. By midnight I found what I needed: a clause exempting any property established before the HOA's incorporation. My land was carved from the original homestead, my well protected by county law. But they either didn't know or didn't care. I called an old contact from my county days, Diane, a clerk who owed me a favor. When she called back, her voice was trembling with surprise. "Tom, your well's still listed as the source for several auxiliary lines in the eastern parcels. So they've been drawing from it this whole time." She hesitated. "Looks that way. The city might not even know." That's when it clicked. They weren't trying to protect the neighborhood, they were trying to bury their mistake. The next HOA meeting was in their precious clubhouse, all chandeliers and burnt coffee. I waited through an hour of budget talk and lawn complaints before I stood up. "Lot 17, I said. "I got 2 letters telling me to shut down my well. I'm here to ask on what authority." The room froze. Randall adjusted his tie, probably wishing he'd stayed home. "Mr. Harland," he said carefully, "we're simply enforcing environmental standards." "Is that right?" I said, laying my file folder on the table. "Because this well predates your HOA by 30 years. And here I spread out the maps your water lines trace directly back to illegal connections from my system." Murmurs filled the room. Randall's face went red. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," I said. "It's plumbing." I left that meeting calm, not because I'd won, but because I'd seen the panic bloom behind their fake smiles. They knew they'd been caught. A week of silence followed. Then whispers started. Some neighbors stopped waving. A few crossed the street when I came outside. That's when I started doubting myself. Maybe I was being stubborn. Maybe I should just give in, pay the fee, hook up to their grid like everyone else. But then, late one night, I checked my water monitor, a simple gauge I'd installed years ago. It showed a spike in flow, triple the usual rate. Someone was using my water, and it sure as hell wasn't me. The next morning, I found survey stakes with bright orange flags near my fence line, new ones fresh from a construction crew. When I confronted the workers, the foreman looked at me like I was a ghost. "Says, here this is common area," he muttered. "It's not," I told him. "That fence was moved 5 years ago after a landslide. You're standing on my land." He backed off, but I caught a glimpse of the blueprint in his hand, Sycamore Ridge utility expansion. They were already building a new system, on my soil, without a single permit. That night I called Mark Caldwell, an old buddy who still worked in county water. We met at a greasy diner off Route 23. I slid the papers across the table. "They're trying to cut me off," I said, "and I think they're building something illegal." Mark looked through the files and sighed. "No permit requests from Sycamore Ridge in 2 years. If they're laying pipe, it's off the books." I leaned back. "Then we've got them." But the HOA wasn't backing down. A few days later, I found my pump control box tampered with wires, stripped casing dented. One spark away from a fire. I called the sheriff, filed a report, and spent half the night rewiring everything myself. My hands were bleeding by the time I finished, but my anger burned hotter than any short circuit. That was the night I called Samantha Rhodes, a retired attorney who specialized in property law. She owed me a favor, and I intended to cash it in. She reviewed my documents and sent a formal letter to the HOA citing criminal interference with a registered utility. 2 days later, Randall called. "Mr. Harland," he said stiffly, "we'd like to meet privately to resolve this amicably." "I'll bring counsel," I said, and hung up. When we walked into the clubhouse that Friday, you could feel the tension. Samantha didn't waste time. "The well is legally registered," she said flatly. "Any attempt to sever or alter it constitutes tampering under state code." Randall tried to protest, but she cut him off. "Negligence isn't a defense." Silence. Not a single board member met my eye. We stood and left. I didn't gloat, not yet, but I knew the ground beneath their feet was cracking. 3 days later, they retaliated. An email went out to the entire community warning about unauthorized water systems and potential contamination risks. They even included a grainy photo of my property. The smear campaign worked. Neighbors started whispering again. One guy asked if I was poisoning the neighborhood. But then, an unexpected knock on my door. Dana Suarez, a young mom from 3 houses down. She held the newsletter in one hand and anger in her eyes. "They're lying," she said. "They're spending HOA funds on a new system without a vote. I'll testify if you need me." I nodded slowly. "You just gave me the last piece I needed." We showed up at the next town hall. Randall stood at the microphone, grinning like a politician. "We're modernizing our water infrastructure," he said proudly, "for the safety and sustainability of Sycamore Ridge." I stood. "Care to explain why your modern infrastructure has been running on my private well for years?" The crowd turned. Cameras flashed. "My name's Thomas Harland, Lot 17. I've lived here longer than this HOA has existed. My well was drilled legally in 1986, and I've got proof 6 homes, 3 belonging to board members, are still connected to it." Gasps, whispers. Dana stood too. "They used HOA funds without approval," she said. "They lied to every one of us." Randall tried to speak, but the mayor intervened. "Mr. Harland, please submit your documentation for public record." "Gladly," I said, and that's when the tide turned. 2 nights later, someone cut the lock on my back gate. I found boot prints in the gravel and wires yanked loose inside my pump shed. It was clumsy, desperate. I fixed it, replaced the lock with steel, and installed a solar camera. I wasn't scared anymore. I was done defending. Then karma arrived with the morning sun. Around 8 a.m., I heard shouts from across the fence. "The water's out," one woman cried. "Nothing's coming out," another yelled. Within minutes, the entire street was in chaos, buckets, hoses, panic. Their shiny new system had failed. I stepped onto the porch and watched as Randall's wife stood barefoot on her lawn, yelling into her phone. For the first time in months, I smiled. Their sabotage had come full circle. By noon, the story hit the news. HOA, water crisis residents left dry after unauthorized project fails. The next night, they held an emergency meeting at the middle school auditorium. Hundreds showed up. Randall stepped to the mic, pale as paper. "We've experienced an unforeseen technical complication. Call it what it is," someone shouted. "You broke it." Dana stood up. "You ignored the man who warned you. You called him dangerous while drinking his water." The room erupted in applause. A county inspector stood next. For the record, he said no permit applications were ever filed for a secondary system. Randall froze. The walls around him, his authority, his arrogance caved in right there under fluorescent lights. That was the moment I stopped being their villain and became the proof of their failure. The following morning, Randall came to my door. No clipboard, no smirk, just a folder in his trembling hands. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "You didn't ask," I replied. He nodded, defeated. Then slid the folder across my table, a formal letter admitting fault, withdrawing all demands, and recognizing my full rights to the well. He left without another word. I stood by the window as he walked down my driveway, a man stripped of power by his own ignorance. Later that week, county officials confirmed what I already suspected: the HOA's new pipeline had been built on a strip of land that legally belonged to me. Every inch of it. The board had to dig it up piece by piece under supervision. I watched from my back fence as they did. The sound of PVC cracking in the dirt was the sweetest thing I'd heard in months. When it was over, I walked to the wellhead, the windmill turning slow above it, and ran my hand along the steel casing. Beneath my feet, the water still flowed steady, unbroken, honest. They tried to bury the truth, but you can't bury what feeds life. Lesson: never let anyone take ownership of what you've built, especially when it runs deeper than they'll ever understand.